Okay, I'm going to read Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 to 35. So it's Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 to 35. And I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. And if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses every fact may be confirmed. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax gatherer. Truly I say to you, whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, that if two of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where two or three have gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a certain king, who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. And when he had begun to settle them, there was brought to him one who owed him 10,000 talents. But since he did not have the means to repay, his lord commanded him to be sold, along with his wife and children, and all that he had, and repayment to be made. The slave therefore, falling down, prostrate himself before him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. And the lord of that slave felt compassion, and released him, and forgave him the debt. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves, who owed him 100 denarii, and he seized him and began to choke him, saying, Pay back what you owe. So this fellow slave fell down and began to entreat him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will repay you. He was unwilling, however, but went and threw him in prison, until he should pay back what he was owed. So when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were deeply grieved, and came and reported to their lord all that had happened. Then summoning him, his lord said to him, You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt, because you entreated me. Should you not also have mercy on your fellow slave, even as I have mercy on you? And his lord, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers, until he should repay all that was owed to him. So shall my heavenly Father also do to you, if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. Context is everything. I'm sure we're all familiar with this passage, but I think that at least some portions of it are frequently taken out of context. And when you see it in context, it gives a very different meaning to the one that we often associate with it. Some of these verses in isolation sound very encouraging. You know, where 2 or 3 of you are gathered, there am I in the midst of them. Or that which you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Now, that sounds great. That which you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. So you bind something and God agrees to do it. Or if you belong to a very small church, sometimes it becomes a little bit discouraging when you don't see so many people coming that you would like to see. Or if you're running an event and not many people turn up for it, but you draw comfort, saying, well, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I in the midst of them. And you even see that sort of thing on banners or notices around church buildings, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them. But when we look at this passage and look at the context of this, it's not terribly encouraging at all. Because what the Apostle Paul, not the Apostle Paul, someone better than him, what Jesus is talking about, what Jesus is talking about is sin and discipline of sin. He's saying that, what you need to do is this. If you can see that your brother, ladies, your sister, is committing a sin which they may or may not know about. Some things you don't know it's sinful, but you point it out to them. And if they then acknowledge it and change their ways, good. You deal with it in private. You don't immediately start gossiping. Matter has to be dealt with in private, and if that succeeds, great. You've won your brother over. However, it also says, if they persist at this and will not listen to you, go and get 1 or 2 others to come and confront them. And that's where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name comes from. And this, I believe, would have conformed to the Jewish way of handling things. They would have recognized this format. Where 2 or 3 of you get together and confront this person, again, if they listen to them, great. It's still being dealt with, not quite in private, but it's still being dealt with, sorted. However, once again, if he still won't listen, then tell it to the church and let them be as a tax gatherer or as a Gentile, both of whom were unacceptable. And I think it's really saying to them, you need to ostracize them, punish them, cut them off. You cannot allow yourself to be associated with their sin. And so where 2 or 3 are gathered, it's about church discipline. It's not there saying, oh, you're only a small band. Oh, never mind. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I in the midst of them. Where you're alone, there he is in the midst of you. He's present all the time. But the context of this says church discipline. Now, it seems to me that Peter starts to grasp this. And he starts to think, oh dear, that's a tall order. How am I going to handle that? Because he starts to think, how many times are you going to do this? So he then asks Jesus this question, how often should I forgive my brother? Will 7 times do? Well, if you're counting, you're not forgiving. You're still holding a grudge because you're counting. 7 times, 8 times, you're dead. Now, I am not a mathematician. I have always been blissfully ignorant of mathematics. It's not my gifting at all. And perhaps those of you who are more gifted in that direction may either confirm my theory or come and tell me you're talking a load of nonsense. But Jesus says to him, no, 7 times, no, I tell you 70 times 7. Now, I suspect that's some sort of perfect number that means something other than just a mathematical answer. But anyway, what we understand it to mean is you've got to go on forgiving. I think that what Jesus went on to say could be summed up in a few simple words. He's really saying to them, you need to be like me, because I forgive and I don't count. You need to go on and on. You need to emulate what I'm like. People come and ask me for forgiveness, and I grant it. If they're truly repentant, I grant it. And that's what you have to be like. Because in the manner in which you judge other people, so God will deal with you. So he tells this story about the unforgiving servant. The thing that makes the unforgiving servant massively guilty is the fact that he has experienced much greater forgiveness. The king was going to sell him and his family and recover the debt, but he pleaded with the king and the debt was forgiven. But it didn't affect his character. He himself, having been forgiven something he couldn't possibly pay, he himself is owed by another servant, but he doesn't forgive the debt of the other servant. He wants his money, and he throws the man into prison, and this is reported to the king, who then sends him to the torturer, saying, I forgave you your massive debt, now you've got to pay back. And it's really saying to us, mind your ways. You have to forgive. This has to be your character. And it's a tall order, because instinctively, in our natural state of sin, forgiveness doesn't come into it. But by being people of grace and forgiveness, we show the world we are different. We have a different master. It doesn't mean that you're simple walkovers, because, as I say, the previous verses are about church discipline. You do have to deal with sin and punish it, in the hope that your brother or your sister is won over and repents of their sinful ways. Perhaps we ourselves at times have been on the receiving end of someone coming to us and say, I need to have a quiet word with you. And I think we can also deduce from this passage that we need to be open to correction if we are involved in doing things we shouldn't be doing. Things that are against what God has taught us to do. And another thing is this, and this is where I balk at this. To go and approach someone and say, excuse me, what you're doing is sinful. I think that in Britain, on the whole, we're rather reluctant to really confront people. On the surface, we seem like we do, but the reality is that especially if it's your friend, you don't want to tell your friend you're wrong because you value the friendship, and you start to think, well, if I say that to them, they might not want to talk to me again. I can't do that. But Jesus doesn't give them options about this. He's saying to them, you have to do it. He himself, of course, confronted people with their sin. And it's difficult. There's all the emotion involved in it. But nevertheless, sin has to be dealt with. And as I say, I find it fascinating that all my life, particularly one verse, where 2 or 3 are gathered, my name, is taken out of this context. I wonder, where did we lose the context? How often do we read this passage and it's there, and it's in front of our nose, and you know what? We still ignore the context. Oh, there's that nice verse in the middle of this nasty thing. That's how we think, because it's certainly what we do. where two or three are gathered in my name, advising, confronting sin, there am I in the midst of them, helping them to deal with sin, is what it really means in its stark reality. You also have to remember this, and this is another thing that I think we gloss over. How many times have you been in maybe a church meeting or even an OM meeting, and we say, let's say the Lord's Prayer together? Because I must have been in hundreds of meetings like it, and we know it off by heart. And so you say the Lord's Prayer. But there's one bit of it always stands out to me, and it says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's the same subject. It's saying, forgive us our trespasses, and oh God, I know that you're going to judge me in a similar fashion to the way I judge other people. Now that's a daunting thought. You set a standard, and God holds you to the standard you set. Because actually we're held to God's standards, which is perfect. And the truth is, the minute we set a standard, I'll guarantee this, you'll fail. Setting your own judgment standard, you won't meet it yourself, because you can't. And none of us can meet God's standard, which is perfection. We know that God has sent His Son, the Father sent the Son, and He has taken upon Himself the penalty for our sin. And He has got what we deserve, died in our place, crucified. But He's risen from the dead and offers salvation as a free gift, as I said, was it last week? We are forgiven. Our debt, which we can't pay, is written off. And we have to demonstrate that that has affected us in our character by us forgiving other people. You know, I used to think that every time the Bible talks about sin and sinning against someone, I used to think, well, they know what they're doing and they're doing it deliberately. But I've found by experience, like sometimes people sin against you and they don't know that what they did to you hurt you or was sinful or whatever. They just don't know. It's not always deliberate. I mean, at least if it's deliberate and you confront them, they know about it. But I think it's very common for it. It's not deliberate. And they don't really know about it until you go and tell them. And that makes it tougher. But you cannot allow, well, you shouldn't allow sin to go on festering, because otherwise it starts to affect your life and it will affect the church eventually, because the church is involved here. And perhaps I am going to be a bit controversial in saying this, but I think the church largely, and I don't say this is true of every church, so don't go around saying George said this, and that about the church, but I think in general, church discipline is not practiced. We tolerate a lot. And we are the losers because we don't stand out as being different. But in the early church, but before Jesus has even founded the church, he set this rule for them, which would be carried over into the church. Because we know, for example, that the Apostle Paul definitely believed and enforced church discipline. And one of those examples was he discovered that in one church there was a man sleeping with his father's wife and that they weren't bothered about it. So he wrote to them very vehemently and said, you need to put him out of the church. They then went the opposite way. They put him out, but when he repented, they wouldn't let him back in again. That's the other side of it. When they repent, you need to forgive. They need to be welcomed back in. But it shouldn't be ignored. So I ask myself a question. Do I reflect Jesus? Am I someone who forgives? Or would people think, what's the point? He holds grudges. He'll never forget about it. He'll always hold it against me. I think that sometimes it takes us a while. We don't instantly just let go of it. I think that sometimes I need to think it through first and remember verses like this and say, well, right, calm down. It's not the end of the world. What they did was wrong, but I need to be like Jesus. I need to forgive. Otherwise, I can't expect to be forgiven. I need to reflect the glory of my Lord by being like him. But sometimes it takes us a while. There are one or two people here who did do things against me, but they wouldn't see it that way. And the relationship hasn't been restored because they don't acknowledge it. And there's nothing I can do about it. Well, when I say nothing, I've tried. But I can't rip their head off and say, will you please pay attention to what I said? But I did feel I needed to do my bit. Otherwise, I'll be guilty. They have to do their bit as well. And that's up to them, and I can't force them to it. But we still have to take responsibility for our own behaviour, for our own attitude. And so the next time you are in a church, I've just thought about this. If you get the chance, if you're in a church and you see one of these notices on the wall that says, where two or three are gathered, there in my name, there am I in the midst of them, have a little chat with people and say, do you know what the context of that is? This is jolly interesting. And see what conversations that'll start. Amen.